I'd like to welcome you all to our briefing, COINTELPRO 2020, How the FBI Continues to Disrupt the Fight for Racial Justice in America. My name is Myaisha, and I'm the campaign director at MediaJustice. MediaJustice leads the Protect Black Dissent campaign and is hosting this briefing in partnership with Free Press. For those who are unfamiliar with MediaJustice, we are a national organization fighting for racial, economic, and gender justice in a digital age. I want to start off by talking a little bit about why we're here today. We're here today because for the last 2 years, the FBI has been exposed repeatedly for surveilling Black activists under a new domestic terrorism term called Black Identity Extremism. This designation, Black Identity Extremist, effectively categorizes Black dissent as an act of violence and signals to law enforcement that Black activists in particular poses a threat to police and public safety. As a result, Black activists are more vulnerable to police harassment, surveillance, and arrest. But unfortunately, these threats are nothing new. Over 50 years ago, the FBI was surveilling civil rights activists under the COINTEL program to discredit and disrupt the civil rights movement at the time. Criminalizing dissent to surveil racial justice activists was wrong in the past, and it has no place in our present or our future. This is why almost a year ago, MediaJustice launched the Protect Black Dissent campaign to fight back against this concerted effort to undermine the liberation work that Black and brown communities of color are doing today, especially since the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. So in addition to hearing more from me, you're gonna hear from a number of experts, including Keedran Franklin, an activist fighting back on police harassment in his hometown of Memphis, Tennessee, Speri, a journalist at the Intercept, who's been covering the issue of politicized surveillance, and Gerardo Romo, a legal fellow at the ACLU's Racial Justice Program, who's been working with us at MediaJustice on our FOIA request and litigation. This conversation will also be moderated by Fulton, the Government Relations Director at Free Press. Before we move into our panel discussion, I'd like to welcome and thank Representative Omar for being with us today. As some of you already know, Representative Omar has been a champion in this fight, fighting against politicized surveillance of Black activists. She has intimate knowledge of this topic and all of the issues that we're going to touch on today. So we're so glad that you could join us, and I'll turn it to you to open up with some remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is a complete honor to be here with you all. Thank you so much for engaging in this critically important conversation. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Angela Davis spoke those words nearly 50 years ago, but they continue to echo today. Our task as organizers is not only to call out a specific instance of racism, it is to recognize that our history is built on the oppression of Black bodies. From slavery to Jim Crow, to redlining, to mass incarceration, to photo suppression, racism is part of the foundation of American power. When the foundation of a society is built on oppression, it takes deliberate and conscious effort to undo that. From civil rights movement of the 1960s to Black Lives Matter movement of today, those in power have sought to otherize, delegitimize, and systematically undermine Black people organizing for their basic rights. This is why the response to Black-led peaceful resistance movements have been infiltration, delegitimization, and sometimes assassination. 50 years ago, a 21-year-old American was murdered in his home by 14 Chicago police officers. They were later found to be colluding with the FBI as part of the COINTELPRO initiative. His name was Fred Hamilton. And we now know that his death came at the hands of his own government. This initiative was a series of covert and often illegal projects aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, and disturbing civil rights organizations, feminist organizations, peace activists, and the environmentalist movement and Native groups. Common tactics used by COINTELPRO were perjury, witness intimidation, and withholding of evidence to falsely imprison and assassinate Black leaders. The same program targeted and surveilled Malcolm X. In fact, the FBI admitted that they intentionally alienated Malcolm X from Elijah Muhammad, ultimately leading to his assassination. The same program targeted and surveilled, recorded, and sought to delegitimize Martin Luther King. They were surveilling him at the time of his assassination. We might think this type of surveillance is a thing of the past. But as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Thanks to a 2017 leak, we know that the FBI Counterterrorism Division created an unfounded domestic terrorism category called the Black Identity Extremism. While they continue to shield information on this, the latest batch of FBI documents obtained by the American Civil Liberties Union and the racial justice group MediaJustice reveals that between 2015 and 2018, the FBI dedicated considerable time and resource to a series of assessments into the activities of individuals and groups it most labeled Black separatist extremists. This information was only released after the group sued the FBI in March over its failure to comply with public requests. The new documents included reports of liaisons, organizations outside of the FBI, and electronic communications suggesting active FBI collaboration with other law enforcement agencies. After the killing of Michael Brown by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, the FBI began spying on Ferguson activists and tracking their movements across states. What's worse, the so-called Black identity extremists were considered a higher threat than white identity extremists. In this despite of the fact that the FBI director, Christopher Wray, has testified that the majority of terrorist cases investigated by the FBI in 2019 were related to or motivated by white supremacists. So let's be clear. According to the FBI, the Black Lives Matter movement, Black-led organizations that are focused around policing of police brutality have not had a single incident of violence associated with their activist work. The FBI appears to be looking for opportunities to disrupt organizing that challenges and threatens the status quo. The reason for attacks and surveillance and the secrecy is because they threaten a system that is built on the power of one race over another. And just as with Martin Luther King, there is no greater threat than a coalition of people organizing together to upend a system that is built on oppression. This is why they conflate white nationalism and legitimate terrorist threat responsible for countless acts of terrorism in our country with peaceful movements organizing for their rights. Our communities have been targeted, surveilled, and undermined for far too long. Our government should not be sabotaging the First Amendment rights of peaceful protesters. Yes, we in Congress must repeal Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which allows for mass surveillance of our own citizens without just cause. But that's not enough. We cannot see these efforts in a vacuum. We must recognize that this is the result of centuries of oppression. And undoing that oppression will take more than just laws. Thank you so much again for joining us and for having this conversation. I get emotional thinking about the kind of activities that you all will talk about today. Because I spend a lot of time with people around the world who are dealing with oppressive governments, and to think that similar things are happening in our own country when we have a constitution that protects us from that is quite alarming and saddening. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your patriotism.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, cool. Well, thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you to the Congresswoman for those incredibly powerful and moving remarks. And thank you, Myaisha and MediaJustice, for being co-partners in organizing this. Thanks to everyone who is watching on Facebook. We are using the hashtag Protect Black Dissent if folks are tweeting or following along. My name is Sandy Fulton, and I'm the Government Relations Director at Free Press. We were meant to be introducing Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, but she just texted that she is in quite a bit of traffic, so she might be stopping by later. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started with the panel. I think we've heard a lot of history between Myaisha and the Congresswoman, but I think I'm just going to do a little bit more background and then just a little bit of framing before we kind of jump into this great panel. So, again, thanks for all being here. Just kind of show of hands, do folks know what COINTELPRO is? Okay, good. So most people do, which is great. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background maybe for the folks watching online. COINTELPRO was a program created by the FBI to disrupt the civil rights movement and other leftist causes from the mid-1950s to 1971 when it was exposed after activists broke into an FBI field office. According to the FBI's own documents, one of the purposes of COINTELPRO was to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalists. The program infamously surveilled Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, Malcolm X, and groups like the Black Panthers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the NAACP. So they did this through a series of covert and often illegal projects aimed at disrupting the efforts to organize for racial justice. One of the major goals of the Bureau was to identify and isolate social justice activists in order to scare them into submission and silence. Now, while COINTELPRO was eliminated following its exposure, the fear of Black movements for racial justice has never gone away. And just 2 years ago, we saw this report that's been referenced a couple of times, the most recent iteration of this, again, out of a leak out of the FBI. It's a threat assessment identifying a new designation called Black Identity Extremism, or BIE, as folks are likely to refer to it. This threat assessment took a few just isolated incidents of violence against police officers by Black men, and then entirely unscientifically tied them together and suggested that folks involved in the movement for Black lives are a threat because of their perceptions of police brutality. So that's what we're really digging into, and related issues today on this panel. Because whether law enforcement call the threat Black power, or Black nationalists, or Black separatists, or BIE like they're doing today, the idea of demonizing and targeting racial justice groups has remained in the zeitgeist of law enforcement. And this morning, we want to discuss what exactly we know about what is happening right now, largely, again, from leaks and FOIA requests, and critically, how that plays out on the ground. I think I'm just going to let, Myaisha kind of went over who was on the panel, but I think I'm just going to let folks kind of introduce themselves super quickly before we jump into questions. So,
Hey, how you doing? Keedran Franklin, Memphis, Tennessee.
Hi, I'm Speri. I'm a reporter at the Intercept.
I'm Gerardo, Romo. I'm a legal fellow at the ACLU Racial Justice Program.
Awesome, thanks. So yeah, I'm gonna start. I'm going to identify folks who I'm gonna kind of throw the question to first, but I do encourage people just to kind of jump in, whatever you'd like to contribute. But yeah, to kind of talk about how this plays out on the ground. Keedran, I'm gonna start with you, if that's cool.
Okay.
Could you give us some background on organizing work you've been doing in Memphis and how you've become personally aware of this sort of targeted, politicized policing happening in your community? For folks who are not super familiar with the concept of politicized policing, that just means how law enforcement polices different ideologies differently. But we'll use that term a lot, politicized policing, politicized surveillance. on the Hill, we talk a lot about the chilling effect that surveillance has on the First Amendment. So yeah, Keedran, can you talk about your background as an organizer and about how your community responded and how this changed or informed the way activists were organizing on the ground?
Yes, most definitely. Thank you. So for years, I've organized around community outreach programs, later going on into doing gun and gang interrupter work, most definitely dealing with our, communities of color. And in 2017, an elected official came to me crying with tears in their eyes, stating that they had just saw a list with not only my name, but other people who are co-founders of the Coalition of Concerned Citizens and people that was around them, or us. They had tears in their eyes, so I knew that they were serious, and they swore to me that they was gonna get this book. However they was gonna do it, they was gonna get this book, and also told me that they have your picture on the wall, names, information, height, weight, size, who you're friends with, and it kind of blew my mind. Although organized around labor and union and ACLU, we felt the oppression. We felt how much they was watching. They would show up to my union office. Even before I got there, I'd come on my lot and there'd be undercover officers sitting on the lot saying that he's having lunch. They've tried implementing undercovers around in our meetings. And so the summer of 2017, after finding this out, there was some papers going around. Someone had leaked an email from a woman who was actually an undercover agent, but she was friends with other organizers and community members. And so once that email got leaked about this woman, and she was watching people like Darius Stewart mom and actions we was doing. Darius Stewart was killed by Connor Schilling in 2015. And so we was like, what is this going on? What's happening? How are, we know who this woman is, but the whole time she's with Homeland Security, actually. Like, whoa, okay. And so that's when attorneys got involved and started filing FOIAs and figuring out other information and, getting emails from our director, Michael Rollins, about sending, people to watch folks like me. So he armed his organized crime unit, multi-agency gang unit, who are a part of the domestic terrorist unit. Like he pointed them at myself and others just for freedom of speech or, protests, positive political protests. And so that's when things really started showing its ugly head on what was going on. Once the ACLU, Tennessee, Nashville got involved, a whole lot of records started coming out. We ended up going to trial in 2018. Judge John P. McCullough was presiding that case. We came out victoriously. We showed that Memphis Police Department had been violating a 40-year consent decree that was filed in 1976, but it got implemented in 1978. And so that's when things started speedballing, like, oh, this has happened before. Why are they continually doing this? And so even after MPD has been sanctioned, they're still continuously doing this. And so learn about BIE around the same time. It showed that, Director Rawlings was taking pointers from someone. So that's when one of the attorneys was saying that in '76, if he had known, he would have filed the FBI also as a defendant in the 1976 consent decree, because those were the orders was coming from.
Right. So we know that wasn't just out of the FBI. We know that this was disseminated to how many, Myaisha?
18,000 law enforcement agencies, which is basically every law enforcement in the country.
Thanks for that. So Alicia, you covered Keedran's story earlier this year. And in many ways, we learned that Memphis could be considered a microcosm of the national trend and history of police surveillance of Black activists. Could you share with us what else you've discovered about the threats organizers are facing in Memphis specifically, and more broadly, how dissent is criminalized in your writing?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. So I have been covering racial justice and civil rights issues for about 6 years, since I went to Ferguson, Missouri to cover the protests over the killing of Michael Brown. And I will get to Memphis in a second, but I think it is important to talk about Ferguson because Ferguson was not only a fundamental moment in Black organizing and protest and activism, which we know, but it was also the moment when this renewed law enforcement focus on Black activism really started to take off. And as you said, there's a long history to that. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies have been targeting Black dissent for decades. But in Ferguson, we really saw kind of like a doubling down on that. And you talked about the BIA reports, but I do want to add a couple of things about it. The BIA report was released internally by the FBI in August 2017, ironically a week before the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where white supremacists killed a counter-protester, Heather Heyer. And we didn't learn about the report until November when someone, possibly with the FBI or some of the agencies that got it, leaked it to foreign policy. And this is an important point because almost everything we know about Black identity extremism and the FBI surveillance efforts we know through leaks to the press. And I'll get back to that a little later. But I do think Ferguson is important. Ferguson is all over this report. The FBI itself refers to what was happening in Ferguson as kind of the reason for putting this report together. And in fact, in the 6 disparate cases they put together as kind of argument that this extremist ideology exists, they refer to 2 young men, Olajuwon Davis and Brandon Baldwin, who joined the protests in Ferguson like so many others, and in Ferguson met some FBI undercover agents. And they ultimately got involved in this plot and agreed to buy and bought what they thought to be pipe bombs from these FBI agents. And to this day, these are the only 2 people that were prosecuted and convicted of any crimes that the FBI has actually called Black identity extremists, although they didn't put that label on them until later. One more thing I'll say, and you kind of talked about this briefly, but there's also this Black identity extremism label was also retroactively applied in the FBI report itself to organizations like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army, which obviously the FBI wasn't calling BIEs back then. The FBI had different names for Black dissent over the decades. They called them Black nationalists, Black separatists, and we actually got a FOIA that shows kind of like some of the reasoning that went into changing the name into Black identity extremists. And we got this email by an official with the FBI Counterterrorism Division, in which he's basically saying, the movement has evolved. It is not looking to separate. That is not the political aspiration, and so we need a different name, basically, which essentially, the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter activists interpreted rightly, I would say, to say that Black Lives Matter is not a separatist organization, and so if the FBI is looking to target them, they cannot justify that by calling them Black separatist extremists, and so they needed to come up with this different label. Now, to get back to Memphis briefly, Memphis is really important because we do know the FBI distributed this report to thousands of law enforcement agencies across the country, but we have no idea what these law enforcement agencies did with that. We know that many of them already have their own biases and their own problems with politicized policing, but essentially what the FBI did was handing out this report that's problematic in many ways, and essentially telling local law enforcement across the country to watch out for Black activists because they might be terrorists of some sort, and they gave them kind of no instruments, no measure to interpret that threat, no idea what to do with that assessment. And that is extremely dangerous. And I'm a journalist, and from like a transparency perspective, that is also extremely difficult to track. When we have all these law enforcement agencies taking this assessment and then interpreting it as they will, it is that much harder for us to learn what they're doing. Memphis is an exception to that because there was this consent decree in place since the 70s, and because of activism like Keedran's and because of the ACLU lawsuit, we got thousands of pages of documents and hundreds of hours of testimony. So we actually know what that surveillance looked like, and Keedran has spoken to it. I'm sure you'll tell us more. But basically, Memphis gives us the most detailed look we have at what political surveillance looks like in practice today. And while this was very much an effort that was led by Memphis police, the FBI kind of framing of this issue definitely inspired it. And you guys mentioned it, but Memphis Police Director himself has publicly spoken about how, police were getting all these reports from the FBI telling them to look out for activists and telling them that protests might turn violent. There was kind of like a peak moment in 2016 after the police killing of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, when we saw protests across the country, including protests in which police officers were killed. And so the FBI was very much on high alert, as they had been since Ferguson. But we saw kind of this moment of really heightened attention paid to Black activism, and the FBI really raising the alarm with a lot of local enforcement, which kind of led to Memphis police doing what they did, essentially. And one last thing I'll add about that is, so I went to Tennessee to write about Memphis as part of a fellowship with Columbia Ira Lipman Center for Human and Civil Rights Reporting. And as part of that, I also went across the state to Highlander Center. And I don't know are y'all familiar with Highlander? So for those who aren't, briefly, Highlander is a civil rights institution that's been around for more than 80 years. That's been a very important training and organizing space for movements across generations. I mean, it's known to have hosted Rosa Parks and Ella Baker, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and more recently, it's been a space where the platform for Black Lives has been written, where we've seen Palestinian solidarity groups, immigrant solidarity groups go through there. And just about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, someone set a building, an office building at Highlander on fire. And this was not the first time. Highlander had come under attack many times over the decades, including by the KKK during the civil rights era. And the person or persons that set this building on fire left a white supremacist symbol on the premises. Now, the local and state police and the FBI have opened investigations into that, but we still to this day have no answers about what actually happened, who did this, why. What instead happened, and activists at Highlander have told me this, the FBI came in and really made them feel as if they were the ones under surveillance. So they came in asking questions like, who do you train? Do you train protesters? Who funds you? Do you know anyone with Antifa? And, mind you, these are people that just had one of their buildings set on fire. Nobody was hurt, thankfully, but, on top of having kind of that direct threat to their life and work and safety, they are also now feeling like that became a justification for the FBI to increase political surveillance. And I think it's important to talk about this because sometimes when we talk about the surveillance of Black activists, the critique or the response becomes, oh, the FBI should focus on surveilling white supremacists instead, or surveilling some other ideology, which, I think that's just like there's a reason why people will say that. We know that the kind of violent attacks in this country in recent years have been by far mostly at the hand of white supremacist far-right extremists. But the point here, I think, is that there are First Amendment protected activities, no matter how awful we might find the ideologies they espouse. And then there is crime, and there is violence, and then there are real, actual threats. And I think these two have been confounded. And I think Highlander kind of gives us a good example of how they've been confounded. And on the one hand, we have a real crime that happened that has not been investigated properly or successfully, or perhaps hasn't been made a priority. On the other hand, we have activists who are posing absolutely no threat, both at Highlander and in Memphis across the state, who committed no crimes, who are coming under increased surveillance and really harassment.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. That is very helpful. That moved me into the kind of next thing I was going to talk about is, right, like no one up here is asking for increased surveillance of different ideologies. But what we are talking about is we are seeing attacks like we did at Highlander and surveillance like we've seen of Keedran at a time when we know the white supremacist violence is on the rise. And that's violence, not ideology. We're talking about criminal violent behavior. I think, Keedran, is there anything else you wanted to jump in there?
I agree.
I just didn't know if you had something to say. Actually, Myaisha, I think I'm going to move into you. So kind of sticking with that, last spring, the FBI testified before the House Homeland Security Committee that they were moving away from the BIE term and were instead using something called racially motivated violent extremism. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what does that signal?
Sure.
What does that signal to you?
Yeah, so I think the FBI moved away from the Black Identity Extremist designation because of the enormous backlash and critique. But I think it'd be dangerous to assume that this change in terminology or classification is a victory. Our fight is far from over. Regardless, and this was mentioned before, like regardless of the terminology, whether we're talking about Black identity extremism, Black racially motivated violent extremism, Black separatist extremism, the description remains pretty much the same year to year. If you are Black and you happen to have a perception of police brutality or racism or injustice in America, the FBI considers you a threat, and that continues to be the same year after year. I also feel like this terminology sort of feels like a euphemism. I believe that the purpose of it is to pretty much disguise the FBI surveillance of Black activists as some sort of race-neutral surveillance. It's meant to suggest that they're investigating all violent extremism the same, regardless of race or ideology, but as we've heard today, that's far from the case. We know that law enforcement responds and targets Black protesters in a specific and distinctive way than when they respond to white supremacists. And most importantly, I think it's dangerous to see that. I mean, I want to say it's progress, but I also still think it's quite dangerous to think of that as a victory, because in doing so, you sort of obscure and move away from the original demands that we were making when we launched the Protect Black Dissent campaign. We weren't demanding equal opportunity surveillance. We were demanding Congress to step in and protect Black protesters from being criminalized because they had, the courage to organize and protest and exercise their First Amendment rights. And lastly, this recategorization actually inappropriately combines white supremacist violence with the so-called threat coming from Black identity extremists. And that's a real strategic decision. It makes it harder for us to actually get information about who the FBI is investigating, even though we know that they're prioritizing so-called Black identity extremists over white supremacists. So,
yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. The FBI had used 11 categories before this recategorization. They notably dropped white supremacists and then adopted this racially motivated. And they also, which I think is interesting, folks might have comments about this, so they went from 11 to 4 categories. And the other categories were anti-government, which just put together like Antifa along with armed right-wing militias, as well as abortion-related, with the suggestion that there was violence on the side of pro-choice activists, and then environmental extremists. So yeah, I mean, they're really kind of conflating the threat from the left and the right and kind of hiding where they can put their resources. Does anyone have any comments on that? Or?
Yeah, and just quickly, and as was the case with the BIE report, then this new kind of categorizations or this new framing the FBI puts out is replicated at the local law enforcement level. So for instance, the NYPD has very recently announced a new unit that's supposedly targeting this broad racially motivated extremism, which makes it, again, from a transparency perspective, even that, we know very little about how law enforcement operates in many places, but that makes it even harder for us to learn who it is they're actually targeting, what it is that they're actually doing under this umbrella terms.
Right, and it's also like as everyone else is getting like more and more kind of specific data, the FBI is moving away from that. And they actually testified, I believe, at one point that 80% of their open investigations were under racially motivated extremism. So like it kind of loses all meaning at that point. When everyone else is getting like obsessed with getting like smaller and smaller data points, the FBI is moving away. And this is coming from members of Congress who were demanding transparency around what investigations were open. And that was kind of their move. Okay, enough for me. Moving on, Myaisha, I just want to talk about this. So since the initial leak of the intelligence assessment in 2017, there have been more leaks out of the FBI about surveilling activists. Namely, the Young Turks leaked files about a continued focus on BIE in a program called Iron Fist. Can you talk a bit about what we know about that?
Sure. So, so after the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, says that they're moving, away from this term, Black identity extremists, later that summer we get this other leak from the Young Turks that basically confirmed that BIE is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. That in addition to this designation, they have a whole surveillance program called Iron Fist that involves electronic surveillance, it involves informants, it involves undercover operations. And in this document, they write that the Iron Fist program is designed to mitigate the threat posed by the BIE movement at a national level. And yet, just as the leak from 2017, the FBI still cannot cite any actual evidence that the so-called Black identity extremists actually exist and actually pose a security threat. And so we're learning that the FBI is directing its resources into improperly surveilling and criminalizing Black activists for exercising their right to dissent at the exact same time that white supremacists are organizing online and violently attacking communities of color. And I also just think it's really interesting too, and I've heard you say this a couple of times, that the police and the FBI are not neutral like actors, right? By saying that Black folks pose a threat because of perceived racism or perceived notions of police brutality is another way of saying that the FBI doesn't believe that there is an issue with police brutality, that they don't believe that racism is actually a problem, and if you dare to think so, you're the problem. And so I think that was further reiterated in the latest leaks from the Young Turks, that the FBI does not consider white supremacists as a threat. They literally say in those leaks that the supposed Black identity extremists are the top counterterrorism priority at this time.
Thanks. Gerardo, I wanted to get to you. So, in addition to the leaks, and I want to, be clear, like these are folks in the FBI leaking these materials and kind of, putting their careers, certainly perhaps their lives at risk to try and begging us to talk about this issue. But in addition to the leaks, we also are, MediaJustice and ACLU have filed a FOIA request to gather information about BIE. Gerardo, I was just wondering if you could explain what exactly y'all are looking for and what you've learned.
Yeah, thank you. The BIE assessment revealed a few things to the public that we're still in the dark about, and we're hoping that our FOIA can shed some light on. So first, as we kind of mentioned earlier, the assessment discusses trainings with local law enforcement agencies across the country and was distributed to 18,000 law enforcement agencies. So the documents that we've gotten discuss trainings with local regional officers and regional offices and has references to local departments, but the locations of the trainings and the offices are always redacted. So we know from the assessment and from the documents we've got that there are trainings and collaboration with agencies across the country, but the exact locations are still unknown to us. And second, we should know, and the public has the right to know, what, if any, precautions the FBI is taking to assure that they are not targeting Black people solely on their free speech activity. Because, as mentioned earlier, the BIE assessment conflates perceptions of police brutality against Black people with threats of violence. And the FBI, through testimony and even in disclaimers in their own documents, constantly claim that they are not targeting free speech activity, but they have not provided any evidence that they're not. And some documents that we've gotten even show that the FBI is putting officers on notice. For example, here in DC, there were documents talking about the Million Man March in 2017, and the FBI putting their officers on notice that that the march could get violent. So the documents we've gotten so far show that they are using political movement to kind of as like threats of violence and using surveillance to kind of capture that. But for the large part of our documents, they are redacted. So there is a lot of information that we don't have. We submitted 2 FOIA requests, and after not receiving any documents, we sued the FBI in federal court in March of last year. And since the lawsuit began, we have been getting 500 pages of potentially responsive documents. And this summer, we spent kind of negotiating search terms, trying to get the best documents that we can get. But the FBI has a policy to only release 500 pages or process 500 pages of potentially responsive materials a month. And so in December, we asked the court to force the FBI to process at least 5,000 pages a month. And in this filing, the FBI revealed in December that they somehow found at least 1 million pages of potentially responsive materials after cross-referencing what they found, and they didn't provide any information as to like what these 1 million pages could be or are, only that they could be duplicates. But even with this potentially 1 million pages of responsive material, they still say that they should only process 500 pages a month, which at that rate we would never get the information. So we are vigorously, trying to get as much information as possible, but we are trying to get that information through this FOIA lawsuit, and it is a slow, kind of resource-intensive process.
Myaisha, is there anything you wanted to add to?
No, that's pretty much where we're at. And again, it's just very alarming how secretive the FBI is being, even when we're going through the proper channels to find more information. They're being incredibly secretive.
Right.
Most definitely. Before organizing around socio-political issues, peace rallies and feeding the community, I wasn't a threat to the FBI or Memphis Police Department. The moment 2016, or probably a year before that during the Darius Stewart actions, but most definitely 2016, July 10th, we occupied the Hernando de Soto Bridge, I-40. And from there, things ramped up. I really started recognizing and seeing and noticing. And so I was lucky enough to see pages that was kept on me. Thousands of documents. And over a course of a few years, the threat assessment would show, so they'd watch me 3 times a day. Every day they'd have to report. They had them, they're called Joint Intelligence Briefings, or JIBs. And they not only disseminated these through law enforcement, they was disseminating these to businesses. AutoZone, Pitt Hyde, Fred Smith, or FedEx, Shelby County School Systems, St. Jude Hospital. They was disseminating these to businesses, which showed a whole nother side. They can't be held accountable in the way that we can hold MPD and law enforcement accountable. And so that's the fear that comes on. Those things, take a whole nother turn when you think about, billionaires having your information. It scared me from wanting to go around my family, because I judged that they would start targeting my family because they can't really get to me. That creates trauma. That creates a whole nother scenario that oppresses and suppresses people of color or poor communities. And one of the things I've begged of John P. McCullough is because I've recently had a son, I have a 3-month-old son. And so some of the sanctions, we was having updates, and I begged him in a video that I do not want my son being watched the way Fred Hampton Jr. possibly is being watched because of his father, or the history that his father has led, along with people like Mark Clark, who was killed alongside Fred Hampton. And so these are real situations that's going on that affects and impacts not only myself, but others tremendously. And so to see documents, and every day, 3 times a day, they said, he's no threat, he's no threat, he's no threat, for years. But they still continuously spend millions of dollars to stop me from saying what I want to say, or, peacefully protesting. They've even tried to force us to start getting permits to protest. It's my freedom. I have the right to protest anywhere I want to. And so there are many ways. They have even chilled the way I speak. They've chilled my freedom of speech. One of the Homeland Security officers, Bob Smith, they put real informants around. Bob Smith was the tip that broke the iceberg. Once people realized we had a so-called white man pretending to be a so-called black man on the internet to befriend protesters and organizers, not just the so-called black people, but so-called whites, most definitely my Palestinian community, across the board, because we believed in intersectionality. So there was the environmental groups, some of everyone we've organized with. And so I just want you guys to know that no one's not being watched, including you guys.
for that, Keedran. Yeah, well, I think I'm gonna ask everybody this question. So yeah, we named this panel COINTELPRO 2020 to draw a connection between today's climate of politicized surveillance and the broader legacy. But how is today's threat different than what we've seen in the past? Whoever wants to.
Yeah, I think Keedran kind of hit on it about all of us being watched. Right now, we're living in a time where jurisdictions across the country are acquiring all sorts of high-tech surveillance tools, policing tools, without any sort of oversight or accountability from their, local representative body. And so this environment where, the police and the FBI are cracking down on activists is happening at the exact time where they're having tools to surveil us in a way that we haven't ever seen before. And so I think that's one distinctive difference between maybe the environment and the threats that our folks were experiencing in the 50s and 60s versus the sort of threats that activists are facing today.
Yeah. And I don't know how much and it's not for me, I guess, not to try to relay so much to you guys, just how much this alters and impacts. And so we have a fusion center, real-time crime center is what they call it. And so there's these blue lights and cameras going all up over the city and everywhere, actually. And how that captures everyone, not just black organizers or, people they judge are threats. It captures everyone and anyone in that. And so the use and tools of these departments being handed down, they're taking this militaristic equipment and turning it inward like a stingray. They're turning it inward towards us and using it, getting trainings from Israeli military. I have documents that show that our police department not only funds, but get training. How they can kill someone with a baton, instead of using combat or being able to de-escalate. They're only taught to escalate and take things to the next level. And so coming into this information is scary. It's scary to think about, And how that's, there's post-traumatic syndrome, and then there's something called continuous traumatic syndrome. Because this is something that continues to happen. This type of thing shaves years off of people's lives.
Yeah, I think that's also there's the kind of covert spying that we don't necessarily know about unless it is FOIA'd by people with a lot of resources. FOIA is a very powerful tool, but it takes a lot of money and a lot of people to go through these documents and demand that law enforcement is responsive, because they're not always. But there's also just the harassment by law enforcement. I know folks in DC, friends of mine, who law enforcement know their names. They're peaceful protesters, but you'll just be walking on the street and they'll be like, "Hey, Myaisha," so it's just very in your face too, the chilling effect that has.
I was just explaining to Alice that I don't show my son on social media because, again, I don't want him being watched, or people who may feel some type of way about what I do and how I speak, or what we're doing, to cause him any harm or negative impact. And so it's interesting to see people turn a blind eye. These are elected officials who also know about some of these things and may like me, but they love their job. And so Memphis is the second poorest metropolitan city in the country. And so you think about people turning a blind eye to morals and principles for paychecks. You think about people turning themselves away from something that's constitutional, that's our God-given rights, because they don't want to rub the wrong elbows with people who are disseminating or have the luxury or the resources to point an organized crime unit or a multi-agency crime unit at just individuals or citizens. So
I want to talk briefly about kind of like how we know what we know. And when I spoke with you in Memphis, you were talking about the fact that you always knew you were being surveilled. Like you saw the cars following you. You knew you were being watched. But then when this trove of documents opened up as part of this lawsuit, you had like the actual validation of how you'd been feeling. You had like the proof in front of you that yes, actually you had been surveilled at, on this day at this time, and this is what they were doing. This is what they were. And even going back to Ferguson, a lot of people in the early days of the Ferguson movement were talking. There were a lot of kind of like elders that were sort of warning younger protesters, that kind of like reminding them of the history of surveillance that Black activist movements had kind of gone through. And there was a lot of talk that the FBI might be around. We now know they were through documents, through the threat assessment report, but it's been a very painfully slow and difficult process to get that information. And FOIA, as you said, is a tremendous tool. Like it's basically really all we have many, many times, but it is extremely costly, time-consuming. Sometimes you get thousands and thousands of pages. Sometimes you get thousands of fully redacted pages. It is, even though in theory anybody can file for a FOIA, it is practically an inaccessible tool for most people. And so what we're really left with is, if the FBI and other agencies are not going to be forthcoming about their work, is Congress pushing for answers. And we have learned quite a bit from a number of briefings. We've learned, for instance, that they were now discontinuing, supposedly, the BIE label to move into this racially motivated label. That's something we learned during congressional testimony. We learned that they actually had no investigations of Black identity extremists from Christopher Wray testifying to Congress. So that's super important, and I would say that, as a journalist, I watched those hearings, so please keep asking those questions because they're very helpful for us. But the other important thing we have, and we've talked about briefly, is leaks. The most important things we know about the whole BIE question, we know because somebody, probably with the FBI, leaked that to journalists at Foreign Policy. The reason why we know about this Iron Fist undercover program is because someone with the FBI leaked that to a journalist at the Young Turks. As you know, I work for the Intercept. We have published a number of stories that rely on leaks like this. And I think what the challenge is here is that we have seen under this administration and the previous administration kind of like a ramping up of suppression of those kinds of whistleblower leaks. And you all know that the First Amendment kind of gives me as a journalist a number of protections, but those protections have not been extended to sources. And these prosecutions, are a problem, and they're like really putting our capacity of doing our work at risk. One thing, I don't know how familiar everyone here is with this, but we have an Espionage Act that's been around since World War I, I believe, yes. And the Espionage Act, which, as the name suggests, was designed to go after spies and foreign enemies, has been used more and more to go after leaks to the press by the Obama administration, definitely by the Trump administration. President Trump himself has called for the targeting of these low-life leakers, as he likes to call them. And this poses an enormous problem because these are matters of huge public interest, and we see a real stifling of the capacity of people that believe these matters should be out in the public to get them out there. And there are a number of people that have been prosecuted in recent years under the Espionage Act, but I just want to mention one really briefly because I think this story is quite relevant to what we're talking about today, and it is not a very well-known story necessarily. But I want to talk about Terry Aubrey, who was the only Black agent at the Minneapolis field office. And in 2018, he was prosecuted and convicted under the Espionage Act for leaking dozens of documents to the press. Those leaks were connected to a series of stories that the Intercept published in 2017, which we call the FBI guidelines, or the FBI secret rules, sorry. And those stories basically showed how the Bureau had kind of given itself more powers since 9/11 and had been ramping up its surveillance capacity, including by recruiting informants. This document showed how they recruited informants, how they spied on university groups, how they infiltrated chat groups, and a whole lot of other, I would argue, very important information that is absolutely in the public interest. And the documents also shed a light on the whole CV, Countering Violent Extremism program, which I think is relevant here because it was in many ways like a precursor to some of the surveillance of Black activists we're talking about here. And Terry Aubrey's attorney said in court that he had been motivated to do this by the racism he saw both within the FBI and in the ways in which the FBI interacted with the communities they interacted with. And he was assigned to work in the mostly in the Somali community in Minneapolis. So he was very uncomfortable with the targeting of Black Muslims that he was tasked to carry out. And he was convicted. He got a 4-year prison sentence. He is currently in prison. And the more people like him end up in prison, the harder it becomes for people, for myself and other journalists, to tell these stories that we believe have to be told. And if we're not going to get it through FOIA, we're not going to get it from the FBI itself. We need to know about this. So I think it's really important to kind of make this, I think that the protection of whistleblowers, the protection of sources should be a priority in terms of First Amendment battles. Journalists are fairly protected, not fully and perfectly, but sources are much greater risk, and when they're at risk, we cannot tell the stories.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a really good segue into kind of one of the final questions I wanted to ask. Like, everyone here except me traveled here, and they're here to talk to congressional staffers, where, like, in a room where people have some power. It's like you work in offices with powers. So what can you do? What can Congress do? And I think that's a really good point. And I personally think that a lot of it is just making noise, just trying to draw attention to this issue. I don't know if we're in a Congress right now or we want to reopen the Espionage Act. However, I do think that, like, your bosses can make noise. The mainstream media isn't covering BIE and these other leaks the way they should be. And, we are trying, like, the activist community is trying to make noise about it, but we need people with power to engage. But Gerardo, did you want to comment on other kind of specific things, congressional requests?
Well,
and then I do want to ask the audience if they have any questions after that.
Yeah, well, just to add on that, I think what's been clear is the FBI has kind of presented a moving target for us. First with BIE, and not even a year later, through more leaked documents, we saw racially motivated violent extremism and racially motivated extremism. So the information is moving rapidly, and the FOIA is not fast enough to capture the information at the rate it's changing, and the FBI is kind of able to obscure, like, how it's doing its investigations through these new labels. As, like, we talked about earlier, a recent Director Ray had said that 80% of domestic terrorism is racially motivated violent extremism, but we don't know, like, how much of that is white supremacists, how much of that is Black identity extremists, which, again, is a made-up term that the FBI created. So under these new labels, it is kind of a moving target, and FOIA isn't fast enough to get this information, so we really do need Congress to make some noise. And additionally, there is the House Judiciary Committee is moving to mark up the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, and currently the ACLU has no position on that bill. However, we've heard that there are rumors that people are considering adding more domestic terrorism crimes to that bill, and we believe that there are already enough domestic terrorism-related laws that the FBI has, and we shouldn't be adding more to that power, because it was under this power that the FBI created the assessment, had the power to make the assessment for BIE, and is already using its power to kind of target and surveil communities of color. So one thing that Congress could do is to not add to the FBI's kind of repertoire of, like, laws that it could use to enforce domestic terrorism crimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I always like to compare a couple of incidents in the area when we're talking about this, and, like, how they don't need more laws. So on Inauguration Day, the Metropolitan Police Department kettled and arrested over 200 protesters in D.C., and they hit them all with 8 counts of felony riot charges, which could result in over 80 years in prison. And there was property destruction that day. Charlottesville, they murdered somebody. White supremacists murdered someone. There were no conspiracy charges. There was no kettling. It is not a lack of resources from law enforcement. It's how they choose to use them. That is the whole politicized policing thing. So yeah, I think that's a really good warning, Gerardo.
Yeah, like, we don't want equal opportunity surveillance. That's not something that even exists, because when we do go that route, we always know that Black and brown communities are going to be the first ones and highly prioritized under any sort of domestic terrorism category. So it's really, really important for us not to sort of confuse or conflate what our demands are. We want our congressional representatives to step in and really protect Black dissent. And they can do that in a number of ways. The House Homeland Security Committee can step in, the House Oversight Committee can step in, the House Judiciary Committee can step in, and really require the FBI to revoke the BIE term, right? They keep saying in these, briefings or in their testimonies that they're moving away, but they're not saying that the agency has completely revoked the term. So all of the, as we mentioned before, 18,000 local law enforcement agencies that got this report haven't heard from the FBI that they have revoked this term. And that's really, really important to remember. We need our representatives to also fully investigate and make all these documents public. We have a right to know what the FBI is looking for. And then we really need a congressional hearing. We really need the FBI to testify on record what they're doing and have our representatives ask direct questions about how we went from BIE to racially motivated extremism. Why does the definition doesn't really change? What is Iron Fist? Who are they looking for? Those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of said this earlier, but my job as a journalist is to inform the public to the best of my abilities about this. And the only way I can do it is if the FBI responds to FOIA requests, if they answer congressional questions and do so kind of like consistently without sort of postponing to the next hearing, which is something we heard a lot. You know, we're always like hearing, I'll get back to you on that, I'll get back to you on that. And we often don't get the answer to the most crucial questions. And then we need sources to be protected. So I don't know about scrapping the Espionage Act, but it is certainly a choice when to use it and when to prosecute. And it is a political choice, but that's been made by the past two administrations, and it doesn't need to be.
Okay. So when we beat Memphis Police Department in a federal lawsuit, there was an independent monitoring team placed over MPD and watching. There's 5-6 sanctions that they have to follow and be in compliance with. And two quick stories. When I first met with the independent monitor who's spearheading that, Ed Stanton III, who was appointed by Obama, at the end of our meeting, my attorney, Bruce Kramer, who was the original plaintiff on the 1976 consent decree lawsuit, had informed Ed Stanton that he had did a FOIA request on himself, and the only thing that came up was an impromptu meeting that he had with Ed Stanton III, and that was after a convention. Yesterday, it just come out, Ed Stanton had put out that he still judges that Bruce Kramer, so-called white man, and the only thing he has on his paper is a meeting with the so-called black man, something interesting. And now they're realizing that they have to take MPD back to court because they're still violating the consent decree in a way. And so I don't know if my call to action is for Congress because, again, my call is how do we protect ourselves in a state that we're coming under? And this is to the community because I'm of the community. I wholeheartedly, feel for the communities that are being suppressed this way. And so how do we protect ourselves in the thick of this when it takes time for the FOIA requests, when it takes time to, rewrite legislation, when it takes time to travel to come and see Congress? Like, how do we protect ourselves is the new question for me outside of all of this. So if I have to live the rest of my life thinking and afraid and fearful and watching and being careful about how I move. My call to action is for every resident of the United States of America to figure out how do we protect ourselves and keep each other safe from these types of acts.
Thank you, Keedran. Okay, I want to see if the audience has any questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. Mm-hmm. Not specifically on BIE, yeah.
Because if you don't get it done there, it would never get done. This is election time, so.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we leverage the elections to pressure members of Congress to act? Yeah.
Well, you know, peaceful protest always works.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent point, and we are trying to make as much noise as we can to do just that.
Yeah.
There are specific people who have kind of specific amounts of power, like the head of like the Congressional Black Caucus or the committees that Myaisha mentioned earlier that have jurisdiction, and we have tried to put pressure on. We have organized delegations of activists to come to DC and talk to their members and kind of encourage them to do just that. So we are trying.
Yeah, and I think for me, part of what I'm thinking about is the fact that everyone has a criminal justice reform platform right now, and are rightfully bringing into public conversation the need for us to decarcerate, the need for us to have a more restorative justice approach. And part of that vision for reforming our criminal legal system has to also include the surveillance and racial profiling of ideology, of Black activists, of the activist community at large. I mean, part of the reason why it was really fantastic to have Representative Omar here today is because part of her vision and her platform on criminal justice reform is dismantling countering violent extremism and the Black identity designation. And so we need to demand everyone who's running for president that they need to incorporate this framework and this perspective into their platform. We can't leave it behind.
I hadn't heard anybody at all talk about it.
Yes?
I just
Thank
have
you.
one question, and really thank you for bringing up the point about like how does the community protect itself, because that's where also my head went. So when it comes to like communication amongst like different community groups, my specific question is how do we keep like the communication that we're doing away from being like surveilled and infiltrated?
So there's one platform that the activist community utilizes, but even that, I don't think we can, because the feds have so much power and so many tools. I don't think we can unless we're in a room sealed off with foil so they can't get, like I don't think we can. And so that's what it comes down to. We have to figure out how to protect ourselves amongst a totalitarian government, essentially, or yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that goes also for the protection of sources and whistleblowers, right? Like, there's only that much we can do to protect them, and we do a lot. But at the end of the day, I think the conversation needs to shift to how do we protect them in a different way, not just through the technology, because the technology will always catch up. And if government wants to find out something, they will. They can. They have all the tools they need. We need to shift the conversation to how do we protect them through laws or through public pressure.
One of the very active debates in Congress right now is the Patriot Act, which is set to expire on March 15th. One of the biggest kind of protections that the public interest community has been pushing for is we want protections around First Amendment protected activities. We're always pushing for that, but law enforcement can often get around that. So right now we're pushing for things like IG reports into what is happening and the disparate impact of the surveillance, because we know that all surveillance has a disparate impact on activist communities and communities of color. So there are vehicles like the Patriot Act where we're having these conversations. Congresswoman just called for 215 to sunset. Like that's definitely a position for sure as well. And then beyond that, yeah, I mean, we are living in kind of like a state surveillance system. There are things like encryption that we need to be sure to try to protect. Like that encryption is real. Right now it is very much under attack by the administration. We need to be vocal in that, like, that it's not possible to just break it for law enforcement without breaking it for everyone, and that, like, we do have a right to encrypted communications.
So after Trump was elected, so by the way, MediaJustice has a network of 100 organizations called the MediaJustice Network, and these organizations range from grassroots base building organizations to independent media type organizations. And after Trump was elected, one of the immediate things that we heard from our network and our community was this fear of how do we protect our organizing. And so from there, we started to launch these digital security trainings that are facilitated by, digital security folks of color who really understand the sort of threats that folks are facing. And so we have a Defend Our Movements tab on our website that kind of explains what is encryption, what are certain platforms, what are certain tools that you can use, and we're likely to also continue to do those trainings in the future. So, you can keep posted on that. I think another thing I might add too is that this doesn't quite get to your question, but it's kind of related. So I think we also need to continue to encourage our own community to not see surveillance as safety, and make sure that we build a muscle and an analysis and a politic that we can keep each other safe. We don't need more cameras. We don't need predictive policing. We don't need more technology to kind of fix the issue of crime or violence that, truthfully, the state played a role in doing in the first place. And so, yeah.
That is an excellent closing remark. Thank you, Myaisha. But yeah, there's something about becoming complacent to this and how that plays in with the commercial side of surveillance as well. Like things like the Ring, working with like state and local law enforcement. Like, yeah, surveillance is not going to keep us safe. And law enforcement's not a neutral actor. Anybody else? I mean, we are at 11:15, 11:17, so we should probably wrap soon. But if anybody has any closing statements, otherwise, thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. Thanks to folks online for watching.